Imagine this. You've poured hundreds of hours into a virtual world, bonded with its characters, braved its challenges, and now, on the precipice of victory, the screen fades to black with a question mark hanging in the air. The credits roll not as a triumphant finale, but as a frustrating anticlimax. This jarring disconnect between player expectation and developer reality is the heart of the unfinished canvas. Why do so many games, beloved and ambitious, limp across the finish line with endings that feel rushed, abandoned, or deliberately left dangling? The truth lies buried deep within the chaotic trenches of game development, a world where passion battles practicality and artistic vision wrestles with relentless pressure. Let's pull back the curtain on the developmental crucibles where these decisions are forged. Imagine a studio in its final weeks, a pressure cooker where the air crackles with fatigue and urgency. As a senior developer once poignantly described it, the last month isn't development. It's damage control. Crunch culture, the infamous soul crunching overtime stretches isn't just a buzzword. It's the engine driving many compromised endings. Teams work 80-hour weeks, living on caffeine and adrenaline, knowing the finish line is a mirage. Every hour spent polishing one aspect of the ending, animating the boss fight. Writing the epilogue cinematic is an hour stolen from elsewhere. Features get axed, narratives get truncated, and complex resolutions morph into quick fades to black. The deadline isn't just a date on a calendar. It's a guillotine swinging constantly, forcing developers to make agonizing choices. Do we fix the critical sound glitch that breaks the final boss, or do we finish the extra cutscene explaining the protagonist's fate? Often, technical necessities win, leaving the narrative threads frayed. This isn't just about missed sleep, it's about cognitive overload. Exhausted developers struggle to maintain creative coherence, resulting in endings that feel abrupt or thematically disconnected. Think of the waves of dissatisfaction that followed titles destined to be classics, like the original Mass Effect rushed conclusion. Its critical plot holes and tonal shift weren't from a lack of vision. They were born from the crushing weight of the production schedule, where the intricate intergalactic finale had to be compressed and simplified in the homestretch. Similarly, the disjointed finale of No Man's Sky initially promised as a galaxy-spanning epic, was ultimately a victim of the relentless need to push a feature complete, or at least, perceived complete product out the door, leaving the uplifting climax feeling hollow and abrupt. But the pressure isn't just time-based. It's the terrifying instability of the creative process itself. Development scopes shift like desert sands. A game might start as an intimate, character-driven drama and midway transform into a sprawling open-world action epic. The ending, originally crafted for the smaller scope, suddenly feels inadequate or impossible within the new, grander design. Late-game changes cascade through the system, demolishing carefully laid narrative foundations. Imagine designing a confrontation where the hero confronts the antagonist in a crumbling cathedral, a moment built to culminate emotional arcs. Then, 6 months before release, the publisher mandates a sudden shift to multiplayer focus. The cathedral scene becomes a chaotic multiplayer spawn point. The personal, epic moment evaporates, replaced by generic combat. The ending must now hastily incorporate new mechanics, often shoehorning in multiplayer-specific narratives that clash with the single-player journey. Destiny to original Forsaken campaign faced this. A deeply personal vengeance story was partially derailed by the need to seamlessly integrate raids and, later, the annual expansions, forcing narrative patchwork. The result, finale moments that, while visually spectacular, sometimes struggled to cohesively resolve the intimate threads they wove earlier. And sometimes shifting leads or creative direction midstream shatters the ending's vision. A project helmed by one director focused on philosophical themes might inherit a new leadership demanding fan-pleasing action beats. The ending, originally a somber, thought-provoking reflection, gets edited to include explosions and boss health bars, losing its soul in the clash of philosophies. The final product becomes a Frankenstein's monster of competing ideas, the ending bearing the most scars. This pressure cooker environment isn't just an accident, it's actively exploited. Look at the strategic, deliberate design of cliffhangers. When a studio or publisher eyes a franchise, the ending might not be seen as a conclusion at all, but as a launchpad. Deliberate ambiguity or massive unresolved conflicts become the norm. It's less about telling a complete story and more about dangling a tantalizing carrot to ensure players return for the next installment. The end of Middle-earth, Shadow of Mordor isn't a standalone victory. It's a clear call to arms for the Shadow of War. Celebrimbor's uneasy alliance with the protagonist is left fraught with tension, his ultimate motives shrouded, promising more orc conflicts and emotional turmoil to come. This isn't necessarily bad storytelling done well. It can build immense suspense, but often it feels like a cold calculation. Publishers mandate open-ended conclusions, explicitly tying the climax to sequel potential. A character might achieve a temporary triumph, leaving the looming threat of the true antagonist for part to. The narrative goal shifts from resolve this conflict to set up the next conflict, sometimes at the cost of satisfying the current one. The artistic vision of the developer, who envisioned a poignant, bittersweet resolution, collides head-on with the business expectation. The ending must leave the audience desperate for more. This tension is palpable. A writer might craft a final scene where the protagonist makes a sacrifice, bringing peace only to be told, make them disappear instead. We need them back next year. The finished game then presents a hollow victory, a Pyrrhic triumph where the true cost is deliberately obscured to preserve the cash cow. The ending becomes less a narrative conclusion and more a calculated hook. Yet, even when the intent isn't commercial, endings get cut. The final months of development are a brutal triage. Features, entire sequences, sprawling areas, and crucially, narrative content face the axe. This is the agonizing reality of content cutting. Developers pour their hearts into sequences meant to provide catharsis, explaining the lore behind the final boss, showing the emotional reunion after the climax, or delivering the thematic punchline. Then, as deadlines loom and QA reports flag show-stopping bugs in earlier levels, these non-essential ending sequences get shelved. They're almost finished, but they're not critical to the game being *SHIPPABLE*. The UI might display placeholder text for an epilogue log. The last boss might drop dead without a bespoke death animation. The game might simply stop loading past the credits. Consider Cyberpunk 2077 and launch. A game with a narrative ambition so vast that it's intended. Complex ending paths were reportedly drastically simplified in the final crunch, leaving many player choices feeling inconsequential in the climax. The developer's vision was there, trapped in the cutting room floor. The pain isn't just technical, it's emotional. It's watching years of coalescing ideas get dragged into the digital dumpster because a runtime bug in Level 4 needs fixing, and there's simply no time left. But here's where the modern era introduces a fascinating twist. Players fight back. The rise of post-launch patches, fueled by passionate communities and vocal social media, has sometimes become a lifeline for lost endings. When players, united by shared frustration, demand resolution, studios often respond. Fallout 76 after its disastrous launch, implemented story patches that significantly expanded the narrative, offering richer character moments and conclusions that the initial release lacked, effectively patching the holes in its ending. Similarly, community outcry over the perceived lack of a definitive conclusion in titles like Destiny 1 led to expansions and updates that provided greater narrative closure, even if the initial ending felt abrupt. Streaming culture adds another layer. Players disassemble games live, hunting for secrets. If data miners uncover placeholder files for unused ending cinematics, vocal speculation erupts. Developers face immense pressure. Do they deny the content ever existed? Do they admit it was cut? Sometimes, the sheer volume of fan demand forces their hand, leading to the eventual release of previously discarded content as free DLC or special editions, giving the unfinished ending a second chance. However, this creates a precarious cycle, the push for day. One patches and live service models means some endings might deliberately be released incomplete, relying on post-launch fixes. This risks players feeling cheated initially even if the ending eventually arrives and leaks. A rogue screenshot of a scrapped final boss fight can send the internet into a frenzy, putting developers in an impossible position. Do they preserve the surprise for the undubbed version, or do they acknowledge the leak and potentially kill the mystique? The community's gaze becomes another factor in the agonizing calculus of what to cut and what to preserve. But let's step back from the human drama and look at the cold, hard limitations of the machine itself, technical limitations. Even without crunch, without publisher interference, the sheer physics of running code on hardware can strangle a developer's grand finale vision. Designing a game meant to run on a specific console or PC with finite resources imposes hard boundaries. Imagine the original vision for Red Dead Redemption to Arthur Morgan's final moments in the snowy mountains, a culmination of character arcs and world detail. The ambition was to have AI reacting authentically to his final actions to create a deeply personal, chaotic, and heartbreaking scene. But when tested, processing complex NPC behaviors, rendering dynamic snowfall, and pushing the cinematic detail required on PlayStation 4 and Xbox One pushed the hardware to its absolute limit, causing crippling frame drops. The solution: whittle down the chaos, reduce the number of NPCs reacting, simplify the snow effects, cap the detail settings near Arthur. While still powerful, the scene no longer matched the original blueprint, a compromise born not from lack of ideas, but from the harsh physics of digital physics and rendering cycles. The ending had to sacrifice emergent intensity for stability. Persistent world games face a unique challenge in endings. How do you declare a definitive conclusion when the world is meant to keep spinning? The Elder Scrolls or The Witcher 3 thrive on player choice and ongoing activities. The narrative climax might be achieved, but what happens after The defeated Big Bad doesn't respawn, but the world is still full of quests, factions, and dynamic systems. Developers must craft a finale that provides narrative satisfaction while not invalidating the player's continued exploration. This often means the ending is more of a narrative endpoint within an ongoing game loop, sometimes feeling less like a triumph and more like a temporary state of affairs. Finishing the main story in Grand Theft Auto Online doesn't end the city's constant criminal activity. It just resets the player's status within its perpetual chaos. Then there are the engine limitations. The toolset itself shapes the story. Building complex, branching endings requires immense resources and specific engine capabilities. An engine designed primarily for linear action might struggle with smoothly executing the intricate dialogue trees and state checking needed for a player-choice-defined finale. Achieving a satisfying conclusion might require systems that trigger hundreds of potential permutations based on prior actions. If the engine isn't optimized for managing such complexity under pressure, like when the final boss is defeated, it might force simplification, fewer endings, less nuanced consequences, or even abrupt cuts to avoid crash. Optimization clauses often become narrative veto powers. A beautiful, long-lasting cutscene showing the world's transformation after the climax might be deemed too resource-heavy, leading to a quick fade to black and text crawl instead. The engine's quirks become invisible handcuffs on the storyteller, forcing compromises where the player sees only the surface, a potentially underwhelming fade to black, or a nagging feeling that something was missing. The vision couldn't be rendered, the canvas couldn't bear the weight. Ultimately, the unfinished ending is rarely malice. It's the mosaic of countless complications, exhausted minds racing against the clock, business plans demanding sequels, creative ambitions colliding with brutal cuts. and the cold coat of wires and pixels refusing to bend to imagination. Players invest so much emotionally journeying through these worlds, only to be met with a conclusion that feels like a closing line hastily scrawled on a napkin. But understanding why it happens doesn't diminish the sting. It highlights the immense, often thankless task of building a universe. The next time you watch those credits roll with a sense of incompleteness, remember the developers who might be staring at their screens, exhausted, relieved, but also hurting, knowing the story they wanted to tell collided with the messy reality of making games. The canvas isn't always finished, but the brushstrokes applied along the way can still create moments of profound connection and unforgettable adventure. The true masterpiece, perhaps, isn't just the ending, but the relentless, passionate struggle to bring the entire world to life in the first place, imperfections and all dot in the vast, swirling ocean of interactive entertainment. There exists a peculiar phenomenon that has echoed through game development circles, subreddit discussions, and living room conversations about unfinished narratives, those moments when players reach the end of their journey only to discover that the road behind them seems littered with unanswered questions, dangling plot threads, and characters who simply vanish. We've all experienced it, haven't we? That sinking feeling when the credits roll not with triumphant satisfaction, but with a perplexing sense of something missing, as if the creators accidentally forgot to thread the final needle on the intricate tapestry they've been weaving for hundreds of hours of gameplay. Today, we embark on a deep dive into the murky waters of narrative incompleteness, examining why some stories leave us hanging by a thread, whether intentionally or accidentally, and how these unresolved fragments have shaped our perception of what truly constitutes a satisfying conclusion. Welcome to Unresolved Threads, storytelling gaps that leave players hanging. Let's first explore the deliberate use of ambiguity in narrative design, the intentional choice by authors to leave conclusions open to interpretation, inviting audiences to participate in constructing meaning from the fragments left behind. This dance between revelation and mystery has been a cornerstone of artistic expression since Homer first spun the tales of Odysseus. But in our era of interactive media, it presents unique challenges that can either elevate a story to legendary status or brand it as frustratingly incomplete. Consider the legendary finale of BioShock Infinite, where the game masterfully guides players through the multiverse with Booker do it only to completely upend their understanding of reality in the final moments, leaving players to piece together the implications of countless possible timelines and sacrificed constants. This wasn't oversight. It was a carefully constructed thematic exploration of choice, consequence, and the burden of endless possibilities. The success of such ambiguity lies in its meaningful integration with the story's core themes rather than being employed as a mere narrative shortcut or, worse, a budget-conscious compromise. Yet when ambiguity clashes with audience expectations, particularly in games where players have invested dozens of hours into decision-making and emotional investment, the perceived abandonment can feel almost personal. Think of the backlash against Mass Effect 3's original ending, not because the developers hadn't provided answers, but because the answers seemed to ignore countless narrative threads carefully cultivated throughout a trilogy spanning 5 years of development. The outcry wasn't merely about the color of the explosion. It was about the feeling that the journey from Commander Shepard's humble beginnings through countless galaxies and battles had been rendered meaningless by a conclusion that betrayed established lore and relationships. This tension between artistic vision and audience expectations represents one of the fundamental challenges in interactive storytelling, where the line between deliberate ambiguity and perceived dissolution can seem frustratingly thin. The brilliance lies in the execution and framing. Compare the endings of games like Firewatch and What Remains of Edith Finch. Both embrace ambiguity, but each anchors its mysteries in emotional truth rather than unresolved gameplay questions. In Firewatch, the central mystery of what truly happened on the mountain remains partially obscured. Yet the emotional resolution between protagonist Henry and Delalee feels complete through their radio conversation across the timeline. Contrast this with the frustration many players felt when Detroit Become Human's narrative warehouses potentially dozens of character fates in its final moments, some resolved beautifully, others deliberately left hanging in ways that felt less like artistic choice and more like careless afterthought. The difference isn't in whether questions remain, but in whether the emotional core of the story finds its completion despite those questions. As we transition from the realm of intentional ambiguity, we must recognize that a significant portion of perceived narrative abandonment stems not from artistic choice, but from fundamentally different approaches to storytelling across various entertainment mediums. Books, television, film, and games operate under vastly different constraints and conventions, each with its own language of delivering climactic conclusions. When we carry expectations from one medium into another, disappointment often follows. Consider the enduring popularity of J.R.R. Tolkien's literary works compared to Peter Jackson's thematic adaptations, the latter famously cutting numerous storylines and character arcs to fit into runtime constraints. A practice largely accepted by film audiences, but potentially infuriating to readers who couldn't understand why certain beloved characters received such abbreviated narratives. This medium-specific literacy shapes our perception of resolution in profound ways, creating a disconnect when we encounter the same story in different formats. In gaming, this medium literacy becomes even more pronounced. Interactive storytelling inherently encourages players to immerse themselves in possibilities, to explore branching paths and multiple outcomes, which often leads to expectations of comprehensiveness that linear media simply doesn't cultivate. Players of game franchises like The Witcher or Dragon Age come to invest not just in the central plot, but in the fates of seemingly minor characters, the resolution of secondary storylines, and the consistency of the world across hundreds of hours of gameplay. When these expansive narratives conclude, the sheer quantity of potential fates creates a mathematical impossibility of addressing every player's unique combination of choices, yet audiences often measure satisfaction against an impossible standard of perfect closure across every potential thread. This disconnect becomes particularly evident when game developers, influenced by film or television narrative traditions, attempt to impose cinematic conclusions onto inherently open-ended experiences, resulting in that familiar sensation of missing pieces in a puzzle we spent considerable time constructing ourselves. Genre expectations serve as another critical filter through which we process narrative completion. Horror narratives traditionally benefit from ambiguity, with the resolution often being whether the protagonist survives rather than explaining the cosmic mystery behind the antagonist. In the Silent Hill series, especially those developed by the original team, the psychological horror is enhanced by leaving interpretations of the otherworldly forces deliberately open to player theory crafting. Contrast this with the expectations engendered by detective genre storytelling, where the satisfaction derived from narrative comprehension hinges on understanding the killer's motive, method, and means. It's no wonder that when the detective game Return of the Obra Dinn embraced a non-traditional resolution structure, it was simultaneously praised for its innovative approach and criticized by players who felt robbed of the traditional detective's satisfaction. Understanding these genre conventions helps explain why identical narrative approaches can generate wildly different reactions across different player communities. Exploring further into the tangible impacts of perceived narrative abandonment, we encounter the particularly poignant matter of unresolved character arcs, those individual journeys that captured our hearts only to vanish into the narrative ether when the credits roll. Video games, with their unprecedented capacity for character development across extended play sessions, have elevated the stakes of character attachment to unprecedented levels. Consider the tragic fates of characters like Lee Everett in The Walking Dead or Arthur Morgan in Red Dead Redemption 2. Both stories masterfully constructed character arcs that concluded with emotional precision, delivering the sense of completion that fans crave despite their inevitably tragic outcomes. What makes these conclusions resonate isn't that they provide happily ever afters, but that they honor the characters' authentic journeys, providing narrative closure that acknowledges their growth, sacrifices, and transformations from beginning to end. The frustration intensifies dramatically when major characters vanish without explanation or resolution, especially when these individuals have played significant roles in the player's journey. Case in point. Numerous Star Wars games have featured memorable alien sidekicks who accompany the protagonist through entire campaigns, only to disappear without trace in the final stages. Or the countless JRPGs where party members develop rich backstories and personal motivations that receive no satisfying resolution beyond serving the protagonist's narrative needs. These narrative sacrifices reflect a common challenge in medium-scale and large-scale storytelling where focus must remain on the central plot progression, potentially leaving rich character development stranded on narrative islands with no metaphorical boat back to the mainland story. The emotional calculus of incomplete character stories differs substantially from unresolved plot threads. When a plot hole creates narrative incompleteness, our intellectual understanding is disrupted. When a character arc remains unresolved, our emotional connection feels violated. Think of the countless players who spent Mass Effect to carefully choosing which squadmates to sacrifice during the suicide mission, only to have the narrative treat that moment as a fleeting dramatic beat rather than a character-defining permanent change, or the disillusionment when long-standing companions in Bethesda games like The Elder Scrolls or Fallout disappear from the narrative with no explanation beyond world-building limitations. These aren't plot holes in the technical sense. They represent emotional breaches, where the contract between creator and collaborator that our investment in these virtual people will result in meaningful narrative payoffs feels broken. The challenge intensifies tremendously when we consider the epic scale of modern open-world narratives, where dozens of potential character arcs interweave across vast landscapes filled with side quests, major plot lines, and environmental storytelling. In games like Cyberpunk 2077 or The Witcher 3, the sheer volume of characters and storylines creates a mathematical impossibility of providing equally satisfying conclusions to every narrative thread. Developers make difficult choices to focus resolution on key characters, potentially sacrificing the completeness of supporting characters or minor NPCs whose stories might resonate deeply with individual players. This creates a fundamental tension between narrative focus and player agency, where creators must constantly balance between addressing the most critical storylines versus acknowledging the dozens of ongoing narratives that players have embraced throughout their journey. As we reflect on these narrative challenges, it's worth considering not just why some endings feel abandoned, but how successful stories consistently navigate these treacherous waters. The most celebrated narrative conclusions typically achieve a delicate balance between addressing major plot lines while leaving space for thematic resonance and player interpretation, all while ensuring that core character journeys find authentic completion regardless of whether every surviving minor character receives an epilogue. Think of the deliberately ambiguous yet emotionally conclusive finale of Half-Life, Alyx, while questions remain about the broader universe. The resolution between Alex, Eli, and G-Man provides sufficient emotional closure to validate the narrative journey, or the way Metal Gear Solid 5. The Phantom Pain transformed its incomplete narrative into a thematic statement about the nature of storytelling itself, using the gaps in the narrative to reinforce the game's core themes about legacy, memory, and the construction of personal identity through narrative reach. Perhaps the most crucial realization in examining unresolved narrative threads is recognizing that satisfaction rarely derives from comprehensiveness alone, but rather from the meaningfulness of the resolution provided to the story that was actually told. The most celebrated narrative conclusions across all media typically provide something more valuable than unbroken threads. They offer thematic coherence and emotional validation that resonates long after control returns to the player. Consider the legendary climax of God of War 2018. While questions remain about the broader Norse mythology and potential future conflicts, the resolution between Kratos and Atreus provides such authentic character development that many players report feeling genuinely satisfied despite obvious narrative continuation hooks. The fundamental truth that emerges from analyzing these abandoned threads is that interactive storytelling inhabits a unique space between authorial intent and audience interpretation, creator control, and collaborative experience. What reads as deliberate ambiguity in traditional media often feels like abandonment when the reader is an active participant whose choices shape the narrative landscape. What constitutes a satisfying ending in film frequently translates poorly to interactive storytelling where the player's journey has departed dramatically from any predetermined path. Navigating this terrain requires a nuanced understanding of narrative that transcends medium, specific conventions, and embraces the unique language of interactive expression, one where closure must be achieved not just structurally but emotionally, where resolution validates both the author's vision and the player's experience. As our journey through these unresolved narrative waters draws to a close, we're left with a profound appreciation for the delicate artistry of storytelling itself, the way threads must sometimes remain deliberately loose to maintain narrative flexibility, how certainty must sometimes yield to mystery to preserve thematic resonance, and how the most satisfying conclusions aren't necessarily those that tie up every loose end, but those that transform journeys' end into meaningful beginning. Whether through deliberate ambiguity, medium, specific conventions, the necessary sacrifices of supporting character arcs, or the inherent challenges of monumental narrative scope, these apparent gaps in storytelling may represent not broken promises, but the very gaps through which meaning flows, those liminal spaces where audience interpretation collaborates with authorial vision to complete the story in ways that neither could achieve alone. In these unresolved spaces, perhaps we find the most authentic reflection of our own humanity in these virtual worlds, complete not with easy answers, but with the necessity of recognizing that some journeys maintain their meaning precisely because they remain perpetually open to continuation, reinterpretation, and the boundless potential of what comes next. Thank you for joining us as we explored these tangled narrative threads, and remember that the most satisfying stories aren't always those that end, but those whose endings remain perpetually alive in our imagination. We pour our hearts into these digital worlds, don't we? We spend hours, days, weeks, even months inhabiting the shoes of characters we grow to love, fighting alongside them through impossible odds, sharing their triumphs and tragedies, investing every fiber of our being into their journeys. We laugh when they laugh, we cry when they cry, we feel the sting of their defeats as if they were our own. And then, abruptly, sometimes when we're teetering on the precipice of the ultimate resolution, right when we crave that cathartic payoff, the story just stops. It fades to black. Unanswered questions hanging heavy in the air like death motes in a forgotten room. There's no neat bow, no satisfying chapter close, no emotional release. It's left dangling, incomplete, and a very specific, deeply wounding kind of emotional betrayal washes over us. This isn't just an unsatisfying ending, it's a perceived abandonment. It's the difference between climbing a mountain only to find the summit barred by a sheer glass wall, and reaching the summit only to be told the view isn't actually the point after all. The cognitive dissonance is jarring because we didn't just buy a ticket to the show. We bought the cast and crew dinner for half a year. We committed emotionally, we built intricate headcanons, we forged a deep connection, and then the narrative just evaporates, leaving us holding this bag of unresolved feelings with nowhere to dump them. Think about it, when a game's ending is merely sad or bittersweet, we feel that loss acutely, but we can process it. We can grieve alongside the characters, find meaning in the tragedy, even embrace the melancholy as part of the artistic statement. When an ending feels deliberately evaded or cut short though, it's different. It feels like a personal slight, like the story we were emotionally bankrolling suddenly went bankrupt without telling us. We're left cheated, not just of a conclusion, but of the very closure our emotional investment was earned and expected to buy. It stirs a unique cocktail of anger, confusion, and profound disappointment that narrative shortcomings elsewhere rarely touch. Compare it to a plot hole that is briefly puzzling but can be hand-waved away, or a tonal shift that feels jarring but can be rationalized. Abandoned endings cut deeper because they violate the fundamental contract of storytelling. The journey must lead somewhere. Somewhere that honors the effort and emotion poured in. It's the literary equivalent of being stood up at the prom after meticulously planning every detail, the hurt magnified because the absence itself becomes the defining feature of the experience. This emotional void doesn't just fester quietly within each player. It ignites a collective fire in the community, a desperate, almost obsessive scramble to reclaim control, to somehow mend the frayed edges of the narrative fabric that the developers seem to cast aside. Suddenly, forums explode with fevered intensity, Reddit threads stretch into the thousands, Discord channels become overnight think tanks dedicated to dissecting every pixel, every line of code, every throwaway piece of lore for the truth the developers missed. Fan theories bloom like digital fungi in the damp, fertile ground of uncertainty, each one attempting to stitch together the gaping holes left by the perceived abandonment, offering not just explanations, but redemption. And then, perhaps most fascinatingly, come the modders. These digital archaeologists and digital sorcerers become the community's white knights, wielding the tools of creation themselves to sculpt the closure the original game denied them. They craft sprawling, multi-hour epilogues, rewrite entire final acts, resurrect fallen characters against all perceived narrative logic, often investing hundreds of hours of uncompensated labor fueled purely by this collective need for emotional completion. There's a fascinating psychological engine driving this frenzy, rooted deeply in our human wiring. We are creatures of pattern, creatures of closure, and the Zygarnik effect, that eerie phenomenon where kicks into overdrive. Unanswered questions are psychological pests, buzzing relentlessly in the back of our minds demanding resolution. It's why we can't get an unfinished song out of our head, why we keep reorganizing messy drawers, why we're compelled to finish every book we start, even if it's terrible. Stories, particularly stories we've embedded ourselves into, trigger this primal need intensely. The quest for completion becomes a form of cognitive appeasement. We desperately need to make sense of the arc, to find that satisfying endpoint that tells us the struggle meant something, that the characters' sacrifices weren't in vain. The abandoned ending denies us this, triggering a kind of narrative OCD where the community becomes a vast, self-organizing therapy session. It's not just about fixing the story, it's about fixing the feeling of incompleteness. This obsessive quest isn't just about the game anymore. It becomes a demonstration of love, a testament to the power the story held over us in the first place. The fans aren't trying to improve a mediocre game. They're trying to rescue the masterpiece they believed they were playing from the jaws of what they perceive as developer negligence or artistic failure. They're essentially performing a narrative exorcism, trying to expel the ghost of the unresolved ending that haunts them and the community long after credits roll in the original product. And this is where the true, insidious power of the abandoned ending reveals itself. It doesn't just sting in the immediate aftermath. It slowly, but surely, begins to poison our entire recollection of the experience, like ink spreading through water. Before the abrupt, unsatisfying conclusion, we may have cherished memories of breathtaking vistas, ingenious puzzles, profound character moments, thrilling set pieces. We remember the laughter with our companions, the gasp at a shocking reveal, the adrenaline rush of a narrow escape. But over time, these vibrant recollections start to fade, overshadowed and tinged by that final, unresolved chord. The memory of the lack of resolution becomes a powerful filter, retroactively coloring every previous interaction. It's like looking at a beautiful, intricately painted canvas where the central figure was left unfinished. No matter how brilliant the surrounding details or vibrant the palette, the eye keeps being drawn back to that glaring void, that unsettling emptiness at the heart of it. The abandoned ending doesn't just diminish the climax. It subtly erodes the value of the entire journey that led there. We start questioning earlier plot points, wondering if they were perhaps just red herrings leading nowhere. If the entire effort was ultimately futile, the game we once loved starts to feel hollow. This disproportionate impact on memory formation can be devastating. It mars the franchise's cohesion, creating a scar tissue around that chapter. The developer's subsequent installments, or DLC, might be stellar, but they're forever measured against the ghost of that unresolved ending, always falling short in the eyes of those scarred. Player expectations shift, becoming fraught with anxiety. A fool me once mentality where the community approaches new releases with a wary eye, perpetually braced for another potential betrayal of their emotional investment. This cognitive phenomenon isn't just fitness, it's a deep psychological principle. Unfinished business creates a persistent mental burden. Our brains crave the pleasure of resolution, the dopamine hit that comes with closing a narrative loop. When that loop remains stubbornly open, it creates a state of low-grade, chronic cognitive dissonance. We keep trying to process it, to make sense of it, to force some semblance of closure internally, but the ambiguity persists. This mental friction builds over time, transforming what might have been a fond memory into a source of lingering frustration or even resentment. It's the difference between a fond scar and a raw, unhealed wound. The memory of the whole experience becomes inextricably linked to the pain of the abandonment, turning a potentially cherished part of our gaming history into a complex emotional knot of what could have been versus what actually happened. Which brings us inevitably to the battlefield of perception, the gap between the promise and the delivery. From the moment a new game is announced, a silent contract begins to form, not in legal terms, but in the court of public expectation and hype. Marketing materials drip. Feed us cinematic trailers hinting at apocalyptic choices, epic confrontations, and world-shaking revelations. Developer interviews tease meaningful consequences, player agency that truly matters, an ending that resonates. Community buzz amplifies this hype machine. Building elaborate fan theories about potential endings, debating lore significance, and investing deeply in the idea of the story's conclusion. It's not just a game anymore. It becomes a cultural event, a shared experience we're all emotionally preparing for. We pore over pre-release reviews, dissect every frame of gameplay footage, each piece of information adding a brick to the cathedral of expectation we are building in our collective minds. And then, when the game finally releases and the narrative thread either snaps or simply trails off into silence, the perception of abandonment isn't just about the absence of a satisfying ending. It's the acute feeling that we were actively misled, that the developers consciously or not inflated our expectations only to leave us holding the bag. It's the crushing realization that the final act never materialized despite #hype train promises. This gap, this chasm between the advertised emotional payoff and the delivered void, becomes the ground zero of the perceived betrayal. Marketing, in its relentless pursuit of excitement, can sometimes inadvertently paint a picture of the climax that the game's scope or design simply couldn't sustain. The early promise of your choices shape the world rings hollow if the ending presents a stark, binary outcome regardless of prior actions. The teased heart-wrenching finale that never arrives feels like a sucker punch. The community hype, now fueled by this perceived bait-and-switch, transforms into a furnace of disillusionment. What might have been seen as an ambiguous artistic choice in a vacuum is interpreted through the lens of broken promises. Players start dissecting not just the story, but why it felt abandoned. Was it rushed? Did budget cuts? Did the developers lose their nerve? This line of questioning amplifies the feeling of being left in the lurch. Strategies for coping emerge, born of necessity. Players engage in sophisticated mental gymnastics. Some engage in radical reinterpretation, insisting the ending is deep and artistic, wielding terms like narrative ambiguity and leaving it to the player's imagination as psychological armor, desperately trying to salvage some meaning from the perceived mess. Others retreat into denial, labeling the ending as not the real one, clinging to fan theories or mods as the true completion. Some resort to cynical detachment, writing off the entire experience as a betrayal and vowing never to trust the developers again. Yet others pour their frustration into analysis attempts, breaking down every flaw, helping to intellectually dissect and neutralize the emotional sting. These coping mechanisms are essential survival strategies in the face of unresolved narrative trauma. They are the mind's flailing attempts to impose order and meaning on chaos, to reclaim some sense of agency over the emotional whiplash. Players become detectives, scrambling for clues they might have missed, searching for hidden messages, desperately trying to cobble together a resolution for themselves, anything to quiet the nagging feeling of the unfinished business left festering like an undiagnosed wound, because ultimately, the most profound impact of an abandoned ending might not be the anger or the confusion in the moment, but the stubborn, unresolved echo it leaves behind, coloring our perception of the story, the community, and even our own relationship with the act of playing. A shadow that lingers long after the credits fade. The journey into a new game often begins not with a controller in hand, but with a trailer that paints a vivid picture of adventure, of choices that echo, worlds that breathe, and endings that linger in the heart long after the credits roll. We see sweeping landscapes, cutscenes charged with emotion, and climactic moments where the hero stands triumphant or faces heartbreaking consequences. The marketing machine, a juggernaut of slick editing and soaring music, promises an experience not just of play, but of completion as satisfying. Well-earned conclusion that validates every jump scare, every strategic move, every emotional investment. It whispers, "This is the ending you deserve." But what happens when that golden promise collides with the cold, sometimes chaotic, reality of development? What unfolds when the journey's final mile is dusted with disappointment instead of the anticipated catharsis? We call it the disconnect, the chasm between what's sold and what's actually delivered, a narrative fault line that trembles through the gaming world. Think of the towering billboards outside your local store, the pre-order bonuses whispering exclusivity. The hype train roaring across social media. Every note in this symphony is carefully composed to build an expectation of an ending worthy of the legend, yet behind the curtain. Development is a tempestuous sea, a constant ebb and flow of ideas, technical hurdles, executive pressures, and shifting creative visions. The marketing, by necessity, often captures a snapshot frozen in time, a polished dream before the storm fully breaks. This isn't just a minor skirmish of expectations. It's a profound tension, legally and ethically charged. Regulatory bodies like the FTC draw lines, defining false advertising as promises so divorced from reality they mislead consumers into a purchase. Games like No Man's Sky launch with grand proclamations of a universe teeming with unique planets and creatures, only for players to find barren landscapes and repetitive algorithms, sparking lawsuits and fury. Cyberpunk 2077 ignites another inferno. Its trailers showcasing a dazzlingly detailed night city, its narrative pathways promising a deep, personal story, only for players to crash into a glitchy wasteland and a central ending perceived as rushed and unfulfilling. The backlash isn't just noisy. It's a collective gasp from a community that feels betrayed, their trust shattered like glass because the final act felt less like a conclusion and more like a collapsed bridge. The core wound, the marketing didn't just sell a game. It sold an ending, a specific payoff that was promised but never truly delivered. The trails of anger, the forums ablaze, the YouTube rants, the petitions demanding change are not mere tantrums. They are raw cries for narrative integrity from players who poured hours, sometimes years, of their lives into a world they believed would honor their journey. The dream they bought into dissolves into a nightmare of dashed hopes. Yet, the crucible of development rarely stills. Promises made in the glow of early previews or trade show demos can become fragile as the development cycle grinds on. A beloved character arc, meticulously crafted in early marketing, might be pruned back due to time constraints. A branching narrative promised to shatter based on your very choice might get flattened into two identical paths. A dynamic world that RESPAW and S differently every time might become static, unable to handle the technical load. The core problem isn't just change. It's the asterisk communication asterisk of that change. Imagine being a developer. You've shown the world a shining star, a promise of an ending that shines like gold. But then internal pressures mount, a story beat doesn't work in testing, a key voice actor departs, or an executive suddenly demands a more monetizable open world. The delicate structure wobbles, adjustments are made, the ending alters. How do you tell the thousands, millions who've bought into the original vision? Announcing, hey, that amazing ending we showed, it's different now. Feels like betrayal. It's a tightrope walk. Too much silence breeds suspicion, like a play where the lead vanishes offstage without explanation. Too many updates can feel chaotic, confusing the audience and eluding the original hype. Some developers try to leak anonymous whispers on data mining forums, hoping for controlled chaos. Others issue cryptic statements about evolving the narrative, which often translates to "we're cutting corners." The most courageous, though rare, might openly discuss challenges, showing behind-the-scenes struggles humanely, like BioWare did mid-asterisk Mass Effect redevelopment, trying to preempt the potential storm. Managing expectations becomes a constant dance, balancing transparency against protecting fragile morale, offering hope without making impossible guarantees. It's a delicate art against the clock, especially as the launch date looms, casting a long shadow over any remaining ambition. Then comes a calculated, perhaps even cynical, wave in the business model, the deliberate design of an incomplete ending, not out of incompetence, but as a strategic pillar for future revenue. Think of the sprawling live service games and episodic adventures where the main story concludes not with a resolution, but a cliffhanger, a gaping question mark hanging heavy in the air. The protagonist's destiny is frozen mid-struggle. The central conflict left smoldering, unresolved. Why would developers do this? Because the human psyche wired for stories craves closure. That unresolved itch, that burning question of what happens next, becomes the most potent leverage they possess. The marketed campaign might have promised an epic saga, but the final chapter is deliberately left dangling, not on the disc, but SDLC bait. Season pass trailers light up YouTube teasing the true ending, the final reckoning, the resolution you deserve. It's a psychological hook, exploiting the very narrative connection players have forged to extract more money. Think of asterisk Destiny asterisk early years, where the story's conclusion felt more like an opening cinematic, the true ending locked behind expensive expansions, asterisk Anthem asterisk promised a world. But its core narrative felt truncated, with major plot points only revealed through post-launch content players had to pay for. This drip-fed resolution is the lifeblood of games as a service. It monetizes player loyalty by dangling the carrot of narrative completion. The psychology is fascinating. Developers leverage the sunk cost fallacy, the immense time and emotion players have poured in, making them more willing to pay just to see the story through. It transforms the ending from a satisfying reward into a transaction. The game becomes not a single story, but an ongoing subscription, where the finale is an unlockable feature, a premium tier in the narrative pyramid. But when monetization bleeds into the core promise, when the advertised story demands an extra payment for its conclusion, the cost feels less financial and more philosophical. It cheapens the journey, turning the sacred ritual of experiencing an ending into a paywall moment, leaving players feeling not just incomplete, but profoundly used. Then comes the reckoning, the aftermath when the credits roll and the collective realization sinks in. Complaints flood forums. Social media erupts with memes mocking the hollow conclusion. Review scores plummet as players feel their emotional journey was betrayed. It's a community management nightmare. The inbox of every community manager becomes a wildfire, fueled by genuine hurt and righteous anger. How do you respond when the product you passionately helped create has left your core audience feeling cheated? Silence is toxic. It breeds conspiracy theories, whispers of malice, and deepens the rift. Acknowledgement, though, is a minefield. Do you defend the creative choices? Yes. The ending is abrupt, but it artistically reflects the futility of war. This can feel like gaslighting to players who just wanted the payoff they were promised. Do you apologize? You're right, we failed you. The ending isn't what we showed. This risks emboldening outrage and setting dangerous precedents for community demands. The tightrope is agonizing. Some developers double down on artistic intent, framing the backlash as a failure of the audience to understand deeper themes, a stance that often inflames tensions further. Others issue mea culpas, promising patches or free DLC to fix the perceived flaws. Think of Mass Effect 3 *, where the backlash was so fierce that BioWare ultimately released an expanded ending patch, not because they agreed it was broken, but because they recognized the deep-seated player pain. The balance between standing by your creative vision and conceding to consumer expectations is the ultimate tightrope walk. Admitting a mistake feels like surrender, defending it feels like arrogance. The best responses, however rare, navigate the middle ground. Express genuine regret for the disconnect, the gap between the vision presented and the experience delivered, without necessarily condemning the final product itself. Explain the challenges, the shifting sands of development, the sacrifices made, framing it as a shared journey with unexpected turns. Offer concrete, tangible steps, revisiting the narrative through free updates, opening dialogue with community influencers, demonstrating a willingness to listen and adapt. The goal isn't to placate anger instantly, but to rebuild trust brick by brick, showing players that their voice matters, that the story isn't finished just because the main credits have rolled. The disconnect between promised payoff and delivered ending is more than just a marketing glitch or a creative whim. It's a seismic event in the relationship between creator and audience, a reflection of the immense pressures within the industry. The very promise of an ending, that ultimate narrative resolution, becomes a beacon of hope, a contract spoken not in legalese, but in shared anticipation. When that contract feels broken, the fallout resonates through communities, coloring future purchases and fueling a weary skepticism. The best games, the ones that endure, are the ones that manage to bridge that gap where possible, to communicate honestly when promises falter under development's weight, and to understand that in the shared universe of gaming, a satisfying ending isn't just a product feature, it's a fundamental covenant with the player. It's the final note in a symphony. If it rings false, the entire performance is diminished. In the hushed corridors of game development studios, where creativity and technology collide under the pressure of deadlines and budgets, there exists a silent struggle that rarely sees the light of day, the battle between narrative ambition and technical constraints. Today, we pull back the curtain to explore the invisible forces that shape the conclusions of our beloved games, examining how performance bottlenecks, testing compromises, engine limitations, and platform constraints often force developers into making painful decisions that can leave endings feeling incomplete despite the best intentions of creative teams. Imagine you're standing before that final boss, the culmination of everything you've invested in throughout your journey. And as the scene unfolds, something feels off, not because the story fails you, but because the technology cannot deliver the vision promised during development. This is the reality many developers face when their most ambitious narrative moments encounter the harsh boundaries of technical feasibility. Performance bottlenecks, among the most common culprits, emerge when developers stretch the capabilities of hardware beyond its intended limits during those critical final sequences. Consider a game designed to feature an epic conclusion where the protagonist faces their destiny amidst collapsing architecture, dynamic lighting that shifts with emotional intensity, and hundreds of particle effects representing the clash between cosmic forces. In theory, this should be breathtaking. In practice, each particle calculated, each physics simulation running consumes valuable processing power and memory. As development approaches its final weeks, the brutal truth surfaces. The intended finale simply cannot perform acceptably on target hardware. Memory management becomes another critical factor in these final moments. When a game's conclusion requires bringing together numerous plot, critical characters in a single location, each with unique dialogue, animations, behaviors, and voice assets, the technical demands can overwhelm even powerful systems. Early builds might crash, stutter, or fail to load crucial elements, forcing developers to agonizing choices. Implement complex workarounds, reduce the scale of concluding scenes, or transition to non-interactive cutscenes. We've all experienced the disappointment when a climactic battle that should feel epic instead feels constrained, when allies vanish as if teleported away, or when conversation sequences feel unnaturally staged because the technical complexity couldn't be sustained. These moments aren't narrative failures. They're the pragmatic consequences of working within technological constraints, the trade-offs developers face become particularly painful when precious development time must be diverted from narrative refinement to technical optimization. Every engineer hour spent on improving frame rate during the final boss fight is an hour not spent crafting meaningful dialogue or refining branching story paths. Every artist day dedicated to compressing assets to fit within memory constraints is a day not spent creating the visual polish that would truly make the ending resonant. We see this in countless games where epilogues feel rushed, where multiple conclusion threads remain unresolved, or where the final minutes consist of text scrolls rather than interactive experiences, choices made not from creative preference but from the cold calculus of technical necessity. Perhaps most revealing is the phenomenon of cut content replaced with placeholder assets in those pivotal final moments. In the rush to meet deadlines, developers frequently insert temporary assets with the intention of replacing them later. A placeholder texture, a simple animation, or even a stand-in voice line reading insert final dialogue here. Yet when crunch time hits and the final weeks arrive, these placeholders suddenly become the final version. We've encountered it in games where critical story moments occur with character models lacking proper facial expressions, where environmental details remain rudimentary, or where sound effects feel unpolished. This isn't disrespect for the narrative. It's the consequence of development prioritization where technical stability trumps narrative polish when time runs out, leaving players to experience conclusions that developers themselves acknowledge as incomplete. As development enters its final phase, another harsh reality emerges: the testing compromises that inevitably impact endings. Quality assurance teams, the unsung heroes who spend countless hours hunting for bugs, operate under intense pressure as release dates approach. Their resources are finite, their time limited, and their methodologies focused primarily on critical showstoppers. When a game-breaking bug emerges that prevents players from reaching the ending, it gets immediate attention. But what about narrative bugs that only surface in the final 20 minutes of gameplay, affecting only specific choices made throughout the game? These often go unaddressed simply because QA teams must triage issues based on impact bugs that stop progress versus narrative quirks that affect coherence. Consider a branching narrative game where dozens of player decisions influence the conclusion. Testing every possible permutation of these choices to ensure they all work correctly presents a combinatorial explosion of scenarios that could never be fully exhaustively tested. What happens when a combination of earlier choices creates logical inconsistencies in the ending? Or when certain narrative paths trigger unintended consequences only in the final sequence? In many cases, these issues aren't discovered until after launch, leaving players to experience narrative breaks that the development team simply didn't have time to resolve. With patches for story inconsistencies arriving weeks or months after players have already formed their impressions of the game, the ripple effects of technical issues on narrative coherence become particularly pronounced in the final sections of a game. A memory leak that gradually degrades performance might cause the game to become increasingly unstable during the epilogue sequence. A save corruption bug might wipe away critical story information between the final battle and the conclusion. Even seemingly minor issues like a character model texture failing to load, making the protagonist suddenly appear faceless during a dramatic moment can shatter narrative immersion when it occurs right where the emotional payoff should happen. COD teams make painful choices about which bugs to fix and which to accept as known issues when release pressures mount, creating a hierarchy where narrative consistency often takes a backseat to technical stability. The engine limitations imposed by middleware or proprietary technology create another layer of narrative constraint. When developers build top game engines not designed for complex storytelling systems, they must either work within those limitations or invest extraordinary resources in extending the engine's capabilities. Consider a developer wanting to implement a sophisticated trust mechanic between multiple characters that affects final narrative outcomes if the engine doesn't support simultaneous relationship tracking among numerous characters with complex state machines. The mechanic becomes prohibitively difficult to implement. The result is often a simplification where only one or two characters can have their relationship states properly tracked, leaving others as static entities unaffected by player choices during the critical final hours. Engine adaptations and licensing decisions further complicate matters. A studio might license an engine renowned for its graphics capabilities but relatively weak in narrative systems, forcing a fundamental compromise between visual quality and storytelling sophistication. Alternatively, a studio might build custom narrative systems on top of existing engines, creating technical debt that comes due in the final stretch when these systems must integrate seamlessly with ending sequences. In one notable case, a developer created an innovative dialogue system with branching conversations that affected character relationships throughout the game, only to discover during integration testing that their custom system created performance issues during the complex final conversations they had designed. The solution simplified the dialogue system in the ending, resulting in conversations that felt alien to the mechanics players had mastered during the previous 50 hours. Perhaps most frustrating are those technical workarounds that result in perceived narrative abandonment. We've all experienced it when a game clearly intended to offer player agency in the conclusion suddenly shifts to a linear experience through technical necessity. This isn't always a failure of vision. It's often the result of developers discovering that allowing player freedom would crash the game or make the ending technically unreliable. The resulting experience where gameplay gives way to a predetermined sequence can feel like a broken promise to players who believed they were making meaningful choices that would shape their ending, with technical reality forcing a narrative compromise that undermines the interactive promise of the medium. Platform constraints further compound these challenges. When developers aim for cross-platform parity, they must often make sacrifices that particularly impact narrative richness. A high-end PC version might offer detailed environmental storytelling, branching dialogue trees with unique responses, and dynamic weather effects that reinforce themes in the ending. Yet to maintain parity with console versions, these elements get simplified, cut, or homogenized. The result is an ending that feels less immersive, less responsive to player choices, and ultimately less satisfying because technical limitations across different hardware configurations force compromise. Development sacrifices made for cross-platform delivery become increasingly evident in narrative outcomes. Consider a game whose intended ending featured a complex, multi-layered environmental puzzle that brought together elements introduced throughout the journey. Playtesting revealed that solving this puzzle on lower specification hardware became frustratingly difficult due to frame rate issues, UI responsiveness problems, and controller latency. The developer's painful solution was to replace the interactive puzzle with a simplified version or even a cutscene, fundamentally altering the nature of the concluding gameplay experience and diminishing player accomplishment. The vision for ending gameplay remained intact in design documents, but evaporated when technical realities demanded simplification. Perhaps most telling is the technical debt accumulated in legacy platform support. When developers commit to maintaining multiple version releases current-gen consoles, last-gen consoles, PC, and potentially even handheld devices, their resources become increasingly stretched. Inevitably, some platforms receive attention to ensure the game functions, while others receive minimal optimization. The result, on older platforms, the ending might exhibit visual glitches, performance issues, or even gameplay bugs that undermine the narrative impact. We've seen games where the conclusion sequences nearly crashed on older consoles, where resolution drops made text unreadable during critical story moments. or where frame rate dips caused gameplay mechanics to behave unpredictably during the final boss battle. All consequences of spreading technical resources too thin across too many platforms. Indie developers face their own version of this challenge, often working with extremely limited resources and target hardware where even basic presentation becomes a struggle. The ambition of their narrative vision must be constantly tempered by the brutal reality of what their target platforms can deliver. We've seen remarkable indie games with compelling narratives whose endings felt constrained not by creative vision but by technical limitations, perhaps a lack of memory for voice assets resulting in text-only dialogue during critical moments, or performance issues forcing camera simplification during emotional character interactions that should have been visually rich. These technical constraints don't just affect individual games, they represent a pattern in interactive storytelling that players have come to accept, perhaps even expect. We enter new experiences with a tacit understanding that the conclusion might feel unresolved, simplified, or compromised in ways that other media wouldn't tolerate. Yet this acceptance doesn't diminish the creative pain felt by developers who pour years of their lives into making experiences that connect with players emotionally, only to have their vision constrained by the very tools meant to realize it. Consider the developers who craft a protagonist's final emotional journey only to discover that facial animation technology can't properly convey the nuanced subtleties they intended. Or the writers who create meaningful branching paths that all converge to the same three endings due to memory constraints. The frustration runs deep when technical realities force simplification of concepts that were once rich and complex. Yet within these constraints lie remarkable stories of innovation and adaptation. Developers become masters of compromise, finding creative solutions that work around technical limitations while preserving narrative intent. Some games turn technical constraints into thematic elements, using limitations as narrative devices that enhance rather than detract. Other studios invest in custom tools specifically designed to overcome their unique technical challenges, pushing the boundaries of what's possible within their constraints. The relationship between technical realities and narrative completeness isn't a zero-sum game, it's a complex interplay where limitations breed innovation, constraints inspire creativity, and hardship often leads to breakthroughs that advance the medium as a whole. Every finalized game with an ending that feels rich and complete despite technical hurdles represents not just a creative achievement, but a technical triumph of problem-solving under pressure. As players, understanding these challenges transforms our perspective as we experience games. When we notice small imperfections in a concluding narrative sequence, we can recognize the countless hours of technical optimization, testing, triage, and compromise that preceded that moment. We can appreciate not just what we see on screen, but what was sacrificed to make it possible. Acknowledging that sometimes the most compelling stories emerge not from unlimited resources, but from the brilliant navigation of limitations. In the evolving landscape of game development, with new technologies constantly expanding possibilities and new platforms continually emerging, the fundamental relationship between technical constraint and narrative expression remains central. Virtual reality, cloud gaming, and real-time ray tracing promise new frontiers for storytelling. Yet each brings its own technical constraints that will undoubtedly shape narrative possibilities in ways we can't yet fully imagine. What remains constant is the passion and dedication of developers who overcome these limitations to create experiences that resonate with us, that make us feel, think, and connect. Their willingness to transform technical hurdles into narrative opportunities represents not just professional mastery but artistic resilience, proving that the most powerful stories often emerge not from perfect conditions but from the determined pursuit of vision despite the odds. As we continue pushing the boundaries of interactive storytelling, let's remember that every ending that leaves us satisfied, every concluding sequence that feels complete despite the technical compromises, represents a victory not just of creative vision, but of human ingenuity turning limitation into possibility. In this intricate dance between technology and narrative, perhaps the most meaningful conclusion isn't freedom from constraint, but the harmony found within it, where technical hurdles become the very foundation upon which compelling stories are built. In the flickering glow of 1,000 monitors, Across sprawling digital forums and hushed private servers, a new kind of court convenes nightly. This isn't a court of law, but the court of public opinion, a volatile, passionate, and remarkably discerning judiciary comprised of millions of players who scrutinize, dissect, and ultimately judge the narratives poured out by developers. Their primary charge: deciphering those moments, those final acts, where a story feels not merely concluded, but abandoned, left hanging like a frayed thread against the stark fabric of the digital canvas. The rise of game analysis within these communities has been nothing short of meteoric, fueled by platforms where screenshots can become evidence, where video essays dissect frame-by-frame decisions, and where established scholars, whose names once graced dusty academic journals, now hold sway over Discord debates and Reddit threads. Think of the quiet influence of a Janet Murray parsing interactive shifts, or the incisive deconstructions of a Ian Bogost finding analogies in procedural generation. Their rigorous frameworks have trickled down, becoming vernacular for players seeking not just entertainment, but understanding. This cultivated narratology empowers gamers to articulate precisely why a resolution feels inadequate. They speak of thematic echoes left unreverberated, narrative arcs truncated before their zenith, central conflicts resolved with a shrug or a sudden, unearned peace. They demand closure that resonates, character arcs that meaningfully culminate, worlds that feel lived in beyond the final fade to black. It's a vocabulary built around terms like unresolved character arcs, shaggy god moments, and the damning verdict. Deus Ex Machina deployed not as a clever twist, but as a desperate escape from narrative responsibility. This new critical lens, sharpened by scholarly discourse, transforms a simple, disappointing ending into an object of intense forensic cultural scrutiny, placing the developer on the stand before an unwavering global jury. And so, when a game lands amidst this discerning populace with an ending perceived not just as weak, but as unfinished, the response is immediate, visceral, and often loud. Score aggregators, those digital barometers of public sentiment, become battlefields. A game lauded for its hours of compelling gameplay can find its Metacritic score plummeting overnight, not because the shooting was sloppy or the graphics glitched, but because the final 20 minutes felt like a betrayal. A script hastily scrawled on a napkin. This is where review bombing, often controversial, emerges as a raw, blunt instrument of player protest. It's the digital equivalent of walking out of a play in protest, except the curtain hasn't even fallen. Think of the seismic resonance titles like Asterisk Mass Effect 3 generated. Months of intricate player choices, galaxy-altering decisions built with meticulous care, only to converge into a handful of visually and thematically similar, philosophically simplistic conclusions. The outcry wasn't just disappointment. It felt like a fundamental breach of trust, a promise made about meaningful consequence broken by a studio, BioWare, once legends of narrative craft. The evolution of gaming criticism has been a direct response to this. Players, once grateful for any asterisk ending, now expect sophistication, coherence, and a satisfying denouement that acknowledges the journey. Standards have soared, fueled by the sheer volume and quality of interactive stories available. Comparative metrics illustrate this shift starkly. A game with a brilliant opening and middling core can often coast on average, but one perceived to have botched the finale risks near universal derision, dragging its overall rating into the abyss. It's a reminder that in interactive narratives, the player doesn't just consume the ending. They invest in it, play through it, and its quality is weighted more heavily than any single preceding scene, making the absence of perceived completion a fatal flaw in the public eye. The court of public opinion does not merely note dissatisfaction. It passes sentence in the form of evaporated sales and reputational damage, a visceral reminder that in the interactive art, the final act is king, yet time, that great arbitrator, works subtle magic on the verdicts passed in this passionate court. Endings once universally pilloried as abandoned don't always fade into obscurity. Instead, they enter a strange cultural purgatory, sometimes emerging transformed through the alchemy of retrospection. Consider the enduring legacy of titles like Al Noir or Alan Wake *. Upon release, their conclusions were met with fierce debate, cries of ambiguity felt like evasion, narrative threads left dangling perceived as developer indifference. Yet years later, as sequels emerged Alan Wake to or as developers elaborated in hindsight Rockstar's DLC clarifications or as players simply had more distance to appreciate the mood and texture rather than demanding explicit resolution, the community consensus often subtly shifts. What was once labeled unfinished might be reevaluated as purposefully enigmatic, a deliberate choice to linger in atmosphere rather than provide neat answers. The revival of classic games often brings these contested endings back into sharp focus. Modders meticulously dissect ancient code, seeking assets, dialogue trees, or level geometry hinting at grandeur, unexplored narrative ambitions lost to time or publisher pressure. These digital archaeologists unearth fragments suggesting games like Star Wars, Knights of the Old Republic to Freelancer were once envisioned with vastly more complex conclusions, giving way to the community's initial abandonment claims and reframing the original release not just as flawed, but as tragically compromised. The cultural memory of these endings becomes layered, a palimpsest where the original, perceived failure sits beneath a newer understanding of the potential lost, the ambition thwarted. It's a testament to the investment players hold. They don't easily forget a story left hanging, and they collectively spend years, even decades, piecing together the missing fragments, debating whether the perceived abandonment was a failing of the creator, a casualty of circumstance, or perhaps part of a deeper, more mysterious artistic statement that simply needed time to reveal itself. The court of public opinion, it seems, sometimes re-examines cold cases, allowing for new evidence and shifting perspectives to alter the historical record. This collective dissatisfaction, this persistent questioning of is that really the end? However, has birthed something extraordinary, the digital preservationist, faced with narratives felt incomplete. Communities don't always just complain. They roll up their sleeves, fire up development kits, and attempt to write the missing chapters themselves. Think of the monumental efforts poured into games like Fallout, New Vegas where modders yearning for more substantial content after the main quest ended created sprawling extra adventures that eclipsed the original in scope and quality. Or Shadow of Chernobyl where the developer's own enigmatic finale sparked countless interpretations and modifications aiming to realize the game's initial, grander, procedurally driven vision. These are acts of love born from a desire to see the developer's promise fulfilled, the world's potential realized. Technical wizardry is matched by ethical complexity. Fan projects tread a fine line. They laboriously reconstruct lost design documents, pull files from development builds, reverse engineer game engines, all to honor the creator's intent to fix what they perceive as an oversight, yet they face the unspoken accusation. Who are they to rewrite the artist's work? The ethical quandary is profound. By completing the story, are they restoring a vision or imposing their own? Are they respecting the developer's creative agency or overstepping into a realm of unintended authorship? This tension fuels passionate debates within modding communities themselves, purists seeking only to restore cut content versus creators crafting entirely new experiences. Parallel to these active restoration efforts are vast archival undertakings. Projects like the CGA Preservation Society or countless dedicated fan repositories meticulously document original alpha and beta builds, developer commentary, design documents, and unused assets, creating a treasure trove of what could have been. These archives serve as crucial evidence in the court of public opinion, allowing players to see the original blueprint for games like Black and White or Duke Nukem Forever *. Comparing ambitious early promises against the often compromised final delivery. This work ensures that the narrative of the game's creation itself, including the perceived abandonment of its intended conclusion, is not lost to the digital ether, providing context for the community's verdict and preserving the story behind the story. It's a vast, grassroots effort to mend the gaps left by developers, driven by an unwavering belief that a world, a story, a character's journey deserves its proper conclusion, even if that conclusion must be written by the very community that felt the loss. And so we circle back to the heart of the matter, to that quiet courtroom buzzing within every gaming forum. The power wielded here is immense, a collective force that shapes not just perceptions, but realities within the industry. Developers watch these forums, these aggregator sites, these modding hubs, knowing that an ending perceived as abandoned can decimate goodwill, cripple sales, and forever taint a legacy. The court of public opinion demands more than just an ending. It demands conclusion that feels earned, that honors the intricate dance of choice and consequence inherent in the medium. It's a demand for narrative integrity, for stories that respect the player's profound investment. While the intensity of review bombing might fade, the nuanced critical analysis, the archival digging, the modding passion, these leave an indelible mark. They force developers to think harder about narrative cohesion, to communicate more transparently about endings, especially in live service games where ending is a fluid concept, and to perhaps take greater risks or invest more heavily in crafting those crucial final acts. The scrutiny born from shared passion and deep engagement ultimately elevates the art form. It reminds developers that